Life in medieval times was rough and dangerous. From deadly diseases to brutal punishments, there was a lot to be wary of. In fact, you wouldn't even last one day if you were born at this time. And we're going to tell you why. Keep watching to find out what these reasons are and how your life would have ended if you had been alive during the Middle Ages. So without any further ado, let's get started. Number 20. Work from dawn till dusk. Forget about working 8 hours a day, because back then, people worked way more than that. If you were an ordinary person living in a village, you'd wake up before sunrise and start working immediately. Your job would depend on what season it was. For example, during spring and summer, you'd spend most of your time taking care of the fields. This included planting crops, harvesting fruits, vegetables and grains, looking after livestock, and so much more. If you were a woman, you'd also have to do household work such as cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, and making clothes for your family. Then there were people who lived in towns. Their lives were also tough, as they had different professions, like blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and more. They had to work long hours to make sure their products were sold and bought by the people of the town. Unlike now, you didn't get paid when you worked in medieval times. Instead, you earned wages which consisted of food, clothing, and money. That's right. You had to survive on the food that you grew or were given as payment. What little money you did earn went towards buying things that you couldn't produce yourself, like salt, fish, or other necessities. Because of all this hard work, most villagers and townspeople had very little free time. Therefore, if you were alive in medieval times, you'd probably die from exhaustion. Number 19. Disease and epidemics. Even if you managed to avoid dying from exhaustion, the next reason could have killed you. During the Middle Ages, there were many diseases and epidemics that wiped out entire communities. The most infamous outbreak occurred in the 14th century when the bubonic plague arrived in Europe. It's estimated that around 30 to 50 million people lost their lives to this disease, with most of them being from Europe. This meant that a third of the continent's population was wiped out within just a few years. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe. If you've been enjoying our videos and want to see more, don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Now moving on. To put into perspective how deadly this disease was, during that same period, the Black Death killed fewer people. Nowadays, diseases and epidemics aren't as widespread, and medical science has advanced so much that we can create vaccines to protect ourselves against some illnesses. Back then, however, they didn't know how deadly a disease could be until it was too late. Number 18. No clean water. Another reason why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times is because of the lack of clean water. Imagine trying to survive without ever having taken a shower or washed your hands. That's what life was like back then. And not only were people dirty, but they were also exposed to all kinds of illnesses. Most of the water sources were either contaminated by human or animal waste, or they were full of bacteria and parasites. Even if you wanted to wash yourself, you couldn't because you didn't have access to basic hygiene products. Plus, there weren't really public bathrooms or showers, so where would you clean yourself? People didn't even know that germs caused illness, so they didn't take precautions to avoid getting sick. Instead, they believed that bad air, or an imbalance of the four humors, was the cause. The four humors were basically the four elements that made up the human body. These were blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. According to their theory, if someone had too much or too little of any of those, they'd get ill. So instead of treating illnesses with medicine, they treated them with more imbalances. For example, if you had a fever, they'd cover you in leeches to remove the excess heat. Number 17. Warfare. We all know capsize the boat and throw everyone off. Plus, pirates were everywhere, and you could get kidnapped at any moment. Number 15. Food and water. While we're talking about traveling, let's discuss food and water. You probably wouldn't die from starvation if you lived in medieval times, but the quality of the food you ate would definitely kill you. During this time period, most people were farmers, so naturally a large portion of their diet consisted of grains and vegetables. However, there were also times of the year when people had difficulty finding food, especially during fall and winter. That's when they had to rely on preserved foods like salted, dried, or pickled meat. But these weren't exactly nutritious. In fact, they were full of salt and preservatives that are harmful to your health. If you were a poor person who couldn't afford any meat, you'd probably die from malnutrition. But if you were rich, you'd die from overconsumption. Royal families ate a lot of meat and sweets, and this led to many of them dying from heart attacks or diabetes. As for water, you'd probably drink from contaminated sources and get sick. Or you'd drink water that was full of lead and other metals. Lead, in particular, was a big problem. Back then, they used lead pipes to transport water, so by the time it reached your glass, it was already contaminated. Number 14. Women's rights. If you were a woman living in medieval times, you probably wouldn't make it past one day because your rights were severely restricted. You weren't allowed to own property or make contracts. And if you were married, you had to obey your husband at all times. Plus, there were many restrictions placed on your freedom of movement. For example, you weren't allowed to travel without your father or husband's permission. You also couldn't testify in court or become a witness. Additionally, you couldn't vote or hold political office. Despite all these restrictions, women were expected to participate in politics. By giving birth to heirs, they basically had to produce children who'd carry on their bloodline. If they failed to do so, they'd be considered useless and might even be abandoned or divorced. Men believed that women should be submissive and obedient, and they tried to control every aspect of their lives. Number 13. Criminal trials. Let's say you committed a crime in medieval times. How would you defend yourself? Well, not very well, to be honest. During the Middle Ages, the justice system wasn't exactly fair. In fact, criminals were often innocent. This was because during that time period, they didn't believe in due process or reasonable doubt. All it took was one accusation for someone to be declared guilty. Not only that, but the accused didn't have the right to remain silent. Judges and juries believed that if someone was innocent, they wouldn't mind confessing to the crime. So they forced people to speak, hoping they'd incriminate themselves. If you couldn't prove that you were innocent, you were found guilty. And even if you were, you still had to endure cruel and unusual punishments. These included being put to death by hanging, burning, or even being torn apart by wild animals. Number 12. High taxes. Another reason why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times is because of high taxes. The amount of tax you paid depended on where you lived. For example, if you were a farmer, you'd pay in crops. If you were a craftsman, you'd pay with a portion of your product. If you were a merchant, you'd pay a percentage of your profits. Then there were the peasants who paid taxes to the nobles. And lastly, everyone paid taxes to the king. Unfortunately, there was no exemption for anyone. Even church officials had to pay taxes. The worst part was that if you couldn't pay your taxes, you'd lose your land or even be put in jail. Number 11. Honor killings. In modern society, we consider honor killings barbaric. But back then, they were common practice. Basically, if you were a woman who wasn't a virgin when you got married, your family could kill you. This included situations where the woman was a victim of rape. And believe it or not, men were also killed in these situations. If a man married a non-virgin woman, he could be killed because he supposedly brought shame upon his family. Nowadays, honor killings are illegal, but thousands of women are still killed each year because of this practice. Number 10. Deadly animals. If you were a hunter living in medieval times, you'd probably make it through one day. But if you were anything else, you'd probably be killed by wild animals. During this time period, predators roamed freely, and there were no laws protecting humans from harm. In fact, sometimes people were the ones who were seen as prey. Bear and wolf attacks weren't rare, and neither were snake bites. These days, we try our best to avoid contact with dangerous animals, but back then, people were constantly in danger. Wolves, in particular, were a menace. They were vicious and fast, and they loved hunting humans, especially children. In fact, during the 18th century, a wolf bit and killed a girl named Marie Walpurgis. She was only 7 years old when the predator dragged her into the forest and tore her apart. Number 9. Weather. Living in medieval times was a gamble. You never knew if you'd make it through the next day because of the harsh weather conditions. Summer was probably the best season because it wasn't as hot as it is nowadays. Winter, on the other hand, was brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and if you couldn't keep yourself warm, you'd probably freeze to death. People also died from floods, droughts, and storms. In fact, in 1530, a massive flood in England killed hundreds of people and destroyed countless homes and farms. People did their best to protect themselves from the elements, but they couldn't always succeed. Sometimes, Mother Nature was just too powerful. Number 8. Child labor. You might think that child labor isn't as prevalent as it used to be, but back then it was incredibly common. Children as young as 4 years old were working in factories, mines, and fields. They had to work long hours and they didn't get paid. In fact, they were expected to work for free and help their families earn money. Most of the time, their jobs were dangerous and they didn't receive any training. They simply had to figure it out on their own. Children also had to work in taverns and inns, serving customers and cleaning tables. They were also employed as servants and nannies. And as you can imagine, this left no time for playing or receiving an education. Child labor isn't acceptable, and it's illegal nowadays. But during medieval times, it was the norm. Number 7. Religious persecutions. If you were a person of a different religion living in medieval times, you'd probably be persecuted or killed. During this time period, Christianity was the dominant religion, and people from other faiths were seen as outsiders. They were often blamed for society's problems, and this led to violence and discrimination. Jews in particular suffered greatly during the Middle Ages. They were accused of killing Jesus, and this gave Christians the excuse to persecute them. Jews were blamed for everything from spreading diseases to causing floods and droughts. And because of this, they were often expelled from communities, or worse, they were killed. Number 6. Lack of education. If you were a peasant living in medieval times, you probably wouldn't be able to read or write. That's because only the wealthy could afford an education. And believe it or not, schools weren't common either. They were rare and far apart, so most kids never attended one. The lucky ones who did get educated were taught by monks and priests, and the curriculum mainly focused on religion. Reading and writing were considered a luxury, and art and music were seen as unimportant. Peasants were barely literate, and they were mostly taught religious stories and basic math. This lack of education made it difficult for them to improve their lives. They didn't have access to new ideas and inventions, and they couldn't understand the world around them. Number 5. Indebtedness. Let's say you lived in medieval times and needed to borrow some money. Where would you go? Well, most likely to a pawn shop. These establishments were run by the church, and they allowed people to pawn their valuables in exchange for a loan. However, interest rates were high, and many people fell into debt. Eventually, they couldn't repay their loans, and they were forced to work as servants or laborers. Debt was a big problem during the Middle Ages. In fact, it was so widespread that many people became known as professional beggars. They traveled from town to town asking for money, and they never repaid what they borrowed. Many families fell apart because of debt. Brothers and sisters were separated and sold to different families, and parents had to watch their children be taken away. Number 4. Torture and punishment. One of the most frightening aspects of medieval life was the possibility of torture and cruel and unusual punishment. During this time period, crimes were often met with severe penalties, and the accused were subjected to brutal interrogation tactics. People were tortured in order to extract confessions or information, and the methods used were often inhumane and degrading. Common forms of torture included being suspended by ropes or chains, sometimes for extended periods, causing physical pain and psychological distress. Being subjected to extreme temperatures, such as being placed in a hot oven or a cold bath, exposure to elements, leaving individuals out in the sun or rain for long durations, and being forced to listen to distressing sounds, such as the screams of others being tortured. The purpose of torture was not only to punish the accused, but also to serve as a warning and deterrent to others considering committing crimes. It was a means of instilling fear and obedience to the authorities and maintaining social order. Number 3. No privacy. Back then, privacy was unheard of. Houses were small and had thin walls, so everyone could hear what was happening inside. Plus, they didn't have doors, only curtains or shutters that could be closed for a bit of privacy. But it was never complete. It's not surprising that medieval people knew everything about each other. Gossip was rampant, and people enjoyed discussing the private matters of others. On top of that, they didn't have their own bathrooms. Everyone shared the same outhouses, so you never had a moment alone. Even sleeping was difficult because you slept in groups, usually with your siblings and parents in one bed. Plus, lice and fleas were everywhere. To subscribe to my channel for more awesome content.